Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tyrone Roach. I'm the chairperson of the National Council of Barbadian Association, and I'm welcoming you here tonight in collaboration with the Barbados High Commission, Guardians of Our Heritage Series. And I'd like to introduce Professor Richard Drayton, who you know from our independence panel discussion over the years. He's the Rhodes Professor in Imperial History at King's College.
Thank you very much, Tyrone. Now we're here tonight to celebrate the birth of a book. But I wanted just very briefly, since we're talking about guardians of our heritage and craftsmen of our faith, to see if we could pause just very briefly for a moment of silence in honor of Albert Williams, the headmaster of Harrison College from 1965 to 1982. Who passed away on Sunday, and who is going to be, his funeral will be tomorrow at 10 a.m. in St. Matthias Church. He was a great man who gave a lot to the school and to the country. Andrea Stuart is a writer and a popular historian with extraordinary gifts. Sugar in the Blood is not her first book. She's previously written a book, Showgirls, about a collective biography of showgirls from Colette to Marlene Dietrich. And her second book, The Rose of Martinique, a biography of Napoleon's Josephine, won the Enid MacLeod Literary Prize in 2004. All of this, however, was mere preparation for this wonderful book. What I'm going to be doing this evening is just very quickly telling you a little bit about the book and about some of the unusual and special characteristics of it. Then Andrea will read for you a couple of sections from the book. After that, I will start the conversation off by asking her a couple of questions, and then you will be able to talk to her and ask her about things that she's mentioned or aspects of the book. But what is this book? This book is at the same time the story of several generations of a family. And this is following the threads of her maternal ancestors as far back as she can find them. And it so happened that at least one part of her maternal line could be traced back to the very origins of Barbados. So what this book became is a kind of history of Barbados from the 17th century, through the origins of the plantation system, through the darkness of slavery, through the period of emancipation, through the period of early 20th century migrations, through the politics of the 20th century, through to the contemporary period, told with the interleaving stories of principally her mother's family for the first bit of the book, and then towards the end, when her father's family becomes visible, they begin to tangle into the story. It's an extraordinary feat. I'd like to say that this is first of all a feat as a work of literature. As I read this book, I thought of one of those very large Russian family novels in which the story of a complicated set of relations is told. This is a book which you will read with the greatest of pleasure because it is broken up into small, perfect little chapters, each of which contains a story which you can read and put aside and close the book and think about. It's at the same time, however, not just a feat of storytelling, it's also a feat of research. One of the astonishing things about the book, and I say this as a professional historian, is the amount of research which underlies it. And as I read through the book and I read one section, another section, I said to myself, I know where this comes from. And indeed, as I checked, I found that she had been reading this book published in 1992. And here and there, she'd actually been going to the Barbados archives to work in the vestry records. So it's a book, in other words, which, to my mind, does something which no other history book does of a popular kind, which is to tie together all of the latest work in Barbadian and Caribbean history over several decades. It's the product, in other words, of an enormous amount, not just of literary power, but also of real intellectual penetration and hard work. And the skill comes in how lightly that learning is born, the way in which the stories carry the argument along. And that again is another evidence of her powers as a writer. But I'd like to conclude by saying this is also a kind of a feat of the spirit. Those of you who know the national poet Kamal Brathwaite will know in one of his poems he writes, I want words so I can recast futures, so I can refashion futures like a healer's hand. And there is, I think, an attempt in this book to approach subjects which normally in the public life of Barbados are things which people talk about in private, but never in public. And I'm talking here really about the kind of complicated, intimate history of race and of violence as they have constructed and marked our societies. I'll offer you one little anecdote which I connected with the film The Stuart Hall Project, which came out this summer. In that film, Stuart Hall talks a bit about his own family and where his particular gifts came from. And he describes a sister who was a few shades lighter than himself, but who fell in love with a man who happened to be of very dark skin. And it so happened that the family didn't approve of this. They forced her to break up the relationship. She had a nervous breakdown. They treated her with electric shocks, and she never recovered, to this day. And this, for Stuart, was something which he carries with him always, as one of the kind of stigmata of our society. Something which a wound which educated him about some of the darker sides of the society. In much the same way, this book has much to tell us about the kind of intimate histories of power, powerlessness, of race, of violence, as they have ordered Barbadian society from the 17th century into our own time. But it is part of the grace of this book that it attempts to take from this story some human moral. And the moral of the story, if I was to find one, is that it is in the capacity of human beings, whatever the insults that are thrown their way, to survive and to be graceful. Thank you very much.
I'm a bit shorter. I can only thank Richard for that wonderful, very generous, intelligent, and I'm very moved by that introduction, so I appreciate that very much. What I thought I'd do is read a little bit, which is a piece that I wrote, which was a spin-off of the book, and which is really tells a synopsis of the whole story, so that you get a flavour of what the book feels like and what sorts of things I'm dealing with. And then Richard will be asking some questions, and then it'll be open to you all. In some ways, I just wanted to say as well that this book could be seen as a series of migrations. A migration of an Englishman to the colonies in the middle of the 17th century, to migrations of African slaves to Barbados, and my family's migration from the Caribbean to Britain. My earliest identifiable ancestor, George Ashby, was one of the many thousands of Englishmen who took ship for the New World in the first half of the 17th century. His destination, Barbados, was in those days the most popular colony in the region, a magnet for swashbucklers and other restless hopefuls who considered mainland America prosaic in comparison. And so George Ashby left England in the late 1630s, a humble blacksmith, and arrived in Barbados a fighting farmer with a hoe in his hand and a sword at his belt. He landed in a country that was different in every way from the one he had left behind. Instead of the English palette, which was permanently tinged with grey, the Caribbean was a chaos of colour, bombarding the senses with dazzling light, heavy scents and unfamiliar sounds. And so a man habituated to winter's shortening days, the turning of the leaves and cold nights, crouched around heat-giving fires, had to become accustomed to the eternal heat and days that were divided equally all year round. The lifestyle, too, was radically different. The population of Barbados, in new conurbations such as Bridgetown, was teeming with young men on the make. Freed from the social restraints of the old country, these men cursed and fought and drank assiduously, coming together in rustic tippling houses to reminisce about the old country and share information about the new. But most importantly, to find consolation in the companionship of their fellow migrants and assuage the loneliness and uncertainty that assailed them in this strange and unfamiliar place, only to separate at the end of the night and return to their isolated plantations, where they would resume their ongoing battle with the hostile wilderness of their plots of land. The work was brutal, the crops, tobacco, cotton, indigo, yielding at best a meager profit. But then came the economic miracle that rescued George Ashby and his contemporaries from a life of abject poverty, exhaustion, and deprivation. Sugar. When production began in Barbados, it was a machine that could not be turned off. Availability stoked desire, and desire stoked production. Soon sugar was known as the white gold, and the planters grew desperate for a workforce large enough and strong enough to harvest it. And so another migration took place, this time a forced one. The trade in slaves had begun as a trickle when the first colonists settled in America, but it soon became a flood once the financial potential of sugar became apparent. Many times I have imagined the journey undertaken by my first slave ancestor, a warrior captured in a raid, a girl stolen for her beauty, an overdue debtor. I picture them leaving behind a scorched village, spirited away in a dusty caravan by black traders and white slavers. By the time they arrived at the coast, whether it was Togo, Dahomey, or western Nigeria, they were already dull-eyed, ulcerated, and weak. They were then incarcerated in slave forts, markets, or prisons, called barracoons, where they were branded with irons and then left to fester for months. Many did not survive. Those who did were loaded on board the wooden whirls, which would transport them across the infamous Middle Passage, that terrible voyage from the African subcontinent to the port cities of the New World. A passage on a slave ship was truly a voyage of the damned. Its talisman, instruments of woe, included manacles and neck rings, locks and chains, cat o' nine tails, and the speculum oris, designed to prise a slave's mouth open so he could be force-fed. I picture my forefather here, manacled and starved in this purgatory, with death all around him. And yet he survives, though his head is filled with memories of the bodies abandoned along the journey to the coast, the shame of his body being displayed on the auction block, and the shit-smeared holes below decks. When the slaver arrived in Barbados a month or so later, it was straight to market. Almost 1/3 of slaves died within that first year, whether it was on the long trek across the African subcontinent, or on the Middle Passage, or during the seasoning, those terrible first months in the New World. Expiring as a result of disease or murder, suicide or misadventure, abuse or grief. Somehow, my unnameable ancestor managed to survive. Almost 3.5 centuries later, my family and I reversed George Ashby's journey, travelling back to England in the summer of 1976. Unlike my first ancestor, we did not have a long sea journey to accustom us to our change in homeland. In his day, one's sense of the world altered slowly, and the traveller had time to become used to new physical conditions. But for us, air travel meant our lives were changed in just a few hours. So there we stood, 2 teenagers, their little sister and parents, in the cavernous confusion of Heathrow International Airport, shivering in our too light cotton clothes. More than anything, we were struck by the gloom. It was as if the sky had been lowered and a grubby canopy had been draped over us. We reached into our carry-on cases for sweaters and shawls. Sometimes it seemed that nothing was the same. I had no idea that I had an accent until people began to mimic my Caribbean drawl. Even the way I walked, the slow glide that is necessary to negotiate the heat of the tropics, seemed parochial in contrast to the fast bobbing walk of the northern urbanite.
I apologise.
We had a new life to learn, and like many migrants in our bewilderment, we turned to the television to decipher the customs of this strange new land. But once again we were confounded. The English sense of humour escaped us. The spectacle of Tommy Cooper, a large shambolic man in a fez, performing lame magic tricks while mumbling indecipherably, left us wide-eyed with incomprehension. Nor could we understand why the sight of a straight man, pretending to be a gay man, prancing around screeching, "I'm free," in double entendre fest, "Are you being served?" was so hysterical. The absence of black faces on British television in this decade was so marked that when an African Caribbean or an Asian person appeared on our set, we were apt to run out of the room shouting, "There's a black person on TV!" Unbeknownst to us, 1970s Britain was a cauldron of bitter rhetoric about race and immigration, which had in turn triggered an upsurge in racism. The country was in recession and unemployment was rising, and a vociferous minority were demanding that coloured migrants be sent home. Every time we commuted into the capital, we had to pass the graffitied slogan, "Stop Coloured Immigration," painted in white capitals as high as the train itself, on an embankment alongside the tracks just before we pulled into Wimbledon Station. It remained there for several years, an enduring reminder of how unwelcome we were in this new land. As I grew up, I realized that my perpetual sense of displacement, the fate of most migrants, was something that would never leave me, but that I could make a life nonetheless. I understood that migration was a kind of death, in which one's old self must be buried in order for a new self to be born, and that this experience had made me who I am today. Inevitably, however, my feelings about the mother country are ambivalent. So much here is now familiar, and so much remains completely strange. My colour still enters the room before I do, and in some situations I have to work inordinately hard to make others put it aside. I know that despite the privileges of my upbringing, some people see me as just another inferior, troublesome black face. And I cannot help resenting the notion that while I am, according to some, not good enough to be British, my ancestors were nonetheless good enough to help build the country, defend it, and die for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I wanted to ask just start with a very general question. How is it that you came to decide to write this book?
I think probably for me the catalyst point was my uncle Trevor. I had my mother's brother was one of those people that most families have one. You know, the one who collects all the stories, remembers all the anecdotes, and he was very, very funny. And he had a kind of library in his head of all the stories, historical stories of the family. And I used to love listening to him and love laughing with him about it. And I was the one who started collecting the stories for the next generation. And I think, what catalyst, the next catalyst was the realization that my parents were growing older, and that if I didn't try and find out everything I needed to know now, I might lose this story. I think that many of us feel that at a certain point. You know, you think, I really have to do it now. to talk to the right people and find out, talk to your granny and, get all that information together. So it was something that I would probably have had in the back of my head for a long time, but then I realized it's time. It has to be done now. So I started beginning to do that kind of work and talking to people and so on. So I think the catalyst was very personal in that way. And somewhere along the line I realized that my family story wasn't just a collection of anecdotes about a family, that it potentially could tell a story, a much bigger story of slavery, settlement, colonialism, and the sugar crop. You know what I mean? That it could be a bigger story, or exemplify a bigger story. But that happened kind of later. The genesis was the passion for history, and in that way that I had kind of learned to love it as a little girl.
What I also found in the book, though, was that there's a particular relationship to the land that I feel in that book. That you write about that corner of St. Philip where it reaches Christchurch, Plumgrove, where the family was for several generations, with a kind of visceral affection. I mean, there's a sense in which you are rooted to that bit of the rock in that place, and in some ways there was something about that piece of land, a story of that space and place which you had to tell. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean, the family started off in St. Philip, and I knew roughly where they were. We then moved to Christchurch, which is where my family's plantation, my grandfather ran a plantation called Plum Grove in Christchurch. And I spent my childhood going wherever we lived, because my dad was at UWI and in Jamaica, so we were coming backwards and forwards. We always came back to this house, the plantation house in Plum Grove. And for me, it was a playground, it was a refuge, it was an adventure park. Every year we would come back to it, and it was so. It's my place. It's the place where I felt my family was rooted, and I remembered it with all of us with such affection and passion, because we spent, every summer we were there, wherever we lived or wherever we were moving. That's the place we went back to. So it's a passionate memory for me. Yeah.
Once you had the feeling you wanted to write this book, what kinds of resistance did you face in terms of, either internal resistance, I can't possibly take on this task, this is too big for me, this is too difficult, there's too much pain wrapped up in this sweetness for me to kind of confront it, or what sorts of external resistance? How did the world of the publisher and the literary agent respond to this idea of a book, of this very unusual book?
Yes, I think that's a really wonderful question, in that I think the resistances were, once I was lucky in that one of my relatives had done a certain amount of the family history research and got us back to the middle of the 18th century. And that helped me break through doing the rest of the family history, with lots of help from people like Bobby Morris and people who were doing other work on my family anyway. But I think the resistance was the realization that if my family, where they were born, dates and births and marriages, gave me the skeleton of the story of my family, that the only way that I knew that I would really understand what they'd experienced was that I would have to become a proper historian and really, really research this whole experience of slavery.
Tell me a little bit about that. How did you research the book?
But both of my previous books had involved quite a lot of research, so I felt like I was relatively competent. I love research, and I love the act of researching. What I didn't realize how much more intense it would be was when you were dealing with something that was so personal, and when you were dealing with moments which were all about your family. So there were bits of the journey when I, for example, did the research on the slave trade properly. I thought I knew a lot about the slave trade. I knew the Middle Passage. What I didn't realize was, as what I mentioned when I was reading to you there, was how much longer the slaves were often imprisoned and how much more terrible the journey was. The Middle Passage was only the crowning part of what was months and months, often years of suffering for slaves captured earlier on. So there were moments of it which were just exhausting emotionally, and I remember thinking, God, I don't know, if I can get through this. Of course, there were lovely moments too, where when I found out the name of my first black ancestor, who was the son of a planter, the 18th century planter, and I found him on a slave compensation return. That was thrilling. I felt like I'd saved him from history and from the fate that normally besets the slave population, being, disappeared, really. And I thought, is it mine or yours? So it was thrilling, you know what I mean? So there were wonderful moments, but there were moments where I just thought, oh, this is too much. It's so hard, this material. And there's so much in it, as you know. That was also very, very difficult. What was quite interesting was that I had a literary agent, speaking of resistance, and he didn't think I should do the book at all. He wanted me to do a biography.
I'm not surprised.
He wanted me to do a biography of Catherine the Great. Because I'd written a biography of Napoleon's Empress Josephine before. And he said, no, this is what you should do. You're building a reputation doing that kind of big biography. He couldn't get it at all. He didn't see why it was a story. And in the end, I changed agents. The other thing was that British publishers weren't interested, which is quite fascinating. Bearing in mind it's such an English story, it's a British story. While on the other hand, when we shopped it in America, in the first round we had 3 offers in the first out of 10. So it was quite interesting that how little it, I learned a great deal about the resistance that Britain has to its own history.
I would have thought it would be exactly the opposite
That's
around.
what I thought. They didn't. It was, they said it was a black interest book, which means that nobody and black people don't read books apparently. And that was one of the things that was said, and they just said it wouldn't work, and lots of things like that. And while on the other hand, the Americans jumped on it, 3 separate houses, and we were like. So it revealed a great deal to me about. I think this is a story that Britain doesn't want to remember, and it's a story that is not nearly as. It doesn't fit into the version of British history that they prefer to.
Well, it's very interesting you mention that because there are 2 ways to read this book. One way to read this book is to read this book as a kind of exploration of Barbadian history, the interpenetration of your family in that. But to be honest, it can be read also from your British location. And the sugar is in the blood of Britain. It's not just in the blood of Barbados. And indeed, exactly as you say, that this is a portrait of the interpenetration of the histories of Barbados and England from the 17th century, interpenetration which is acted out in terms of beating, rape, forced labor, the theft of the results of labor, and indeed there are reasons why this. Of course, famously, Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery didn't find a UK publisher for 20 years. It was only after he was Prime Minister in 1964. That the decision was taken by British press to bring it out. So that I think you may be right, that there are forms of resistance to a particular kind of story.
I think if I had been writing as a descendant of a white plantation owner, as a white descendant of a white plantation owner, I might have been luckier. But I think what it just was, it is. I firmly believe that this is that Benedict Anderson saying that that a country is a nation is an imagined community, and it's a question of what we remember and what we choose to forget. And Britain has done a lot of work forgetting us, and this book reminded people of it. While in America, the story connects to the wider issues of Caribbean history and kind of histories of diasporas and so on. And so there was much less resistance to it.
Well, I want to ask the last question now before I let the audience. How do you work as a writer? Balzac famously used to sit in bed and drink 50 cups of coffee a day as he wrote, and other people get up at 4 in the morning. Other people work very late at night. What are for those of you people in the room here who dream of writing a big book? How do you actually do that? How do you actually work at that as a writer?
Before I had children, I'm by nature quite obsessive, so I could write for huge tracts of time. I would research, and then assimilate it, and then write in really long periods of time. Once you have children, and they're just like, no, you can't. You have to work your life around them. So I used to have lots of rituals. My thing was that I'd wake up and I'd walk to the computer. I wouldn't have a cup of coffee, I wouldn't have a shower, I wouldn't clean my teeth, I just turned the computer on and started. I didn't do anything until I'd anchored myself in the book for an hour. Then I got to have a cup of tea or coffee, then I had breakfast, because then I was in the work and it was fine. But, of course, once you have children, none of these things work. So basically I steal time around them. I've become much more, I can write anywhere. I can write on a bus, I can write on a train. It changes the way that you work. I'm not sure that I work as, the work is as good, I have to say, when I'm doing it around that clock. But it's and I think everyone has to find their own rhythm if you're interested in becoming a writer. Some people are first thing in the morning writers. I usually try and but I work because I'm working around various things. I keep it kind of relatively normal time frames. But before, when I was just writing, we would write till 3 o'clock in the morning, sleep late sometimes, and just run my time according to how things were going. But yes, now it's just opportunistic grabbing.
Well, thank you very much. So I wondered if the audience here would like to ask any questions.
I've got one.
Yeah. How did you start the research, and how long did it take you? Because you went right back, about 300 years almost.
Yes. I forgot about that part. When once it started and I realised I was really interested, and the uncle that I mentioned had put me in touch with this other relative who had done part of the family history research. I did a lot of archival research to try and push it back. And as I said, other people helped because there were other people who were working on the family anyway, which was lovely. Then I realized, as I said, that unfortunately that I was going to have to do all this one historical research. And I did a lot of that at the Barbados Museum, at the university. Lots of the historical material was also available here, so I did research in London. But the whole book took me about 6 years, so it was a long project. And the broken by life, all the other things that happened. But it was a long labor of love. And I don't know, I think, Richard knows what it's like when you're doing books. They're so demanding that you can't think about it as a whole. It's that thing of how do you eat an elephant? You eat it at each mouthful, and you have to do it bit by bit, because if you thought about it, you'd never be able to do it. So you kind of break it up and do bits and pieces until miraculously you find that you've got this bigger whole.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. The words which you read are so. Thank you. The words which you read are so powerful in their own right, but even more so when they're, I think, read by the person who penned the book. Which part of the book did you find the most difficult to write emotionally? You find the most challenging to write emotionally? That's my first question.
That's an interesting question. I would say that the beginning part of the book is the life of George Ashby, this Englishman arriving in the Caribbean, and that was technically difficult because there was so much going on. but not personally very difficult, because I suppose the reason I wanted to do it was that, in the US, the story of the founding fathers and the first settlers have become immortalized. And part of the untelling of the story of Britain's history is that Britain doesn't even remember these thousands and thousands and thousands of people who went to the Caribbean, and indeed all across the Americas. And I kind of wanted to put them back into history. So it was I really enjoyed it very much, putting them back there, but it wasn't quite so demanding emotionally. The bit that was difficult was the second half, the second chunk, which was kind of relocating my slave ancestors, really appreciating and reading slave narratives and how what you said about the intimate violence of the plantation, and imagining, because I wanted to be, at one point, my fourth grandfather, a man called Robert Cooper Ashby, has a plantation called Burke's in Christchurch, and 250 acres. He's got 300 slaves, I think that's right, and he's got 18 slave children with different women, from which I'm descended from one of them. At the same time, he's married to his white official wife and the son. And the idea of living on this plantation, the intensity of this, the sheer, I can say that one of Robert Cooper's women, the women that he had children with, clearly was a very long term. He had 11 children with her, clearly, and once his wife died, they lived together publicly. But the rest of the women, including the woman from whom I'm descended, were concubines. You don't know that you know that there's a degree, probably, of course, of perhaps violence or rape, and the fact that, for example, the woman who was the mother of the 11 was his wife's body slave. So she was the woman who woke her up every morning and wiped her skin and slept in her room occasionally, who was with his wife at all times. And at some point he must have looked over and decided he wanted to have sexual relations with this woman. And the atmosphere of the plantation house, the sheer unhappiness of it, you know what I mean? The intensity of emotion of this space. I mean, you can see why novelists write about plantations, because, and make movies of them. We've got all these movies out now, is because you can't imagine a more intense scenario with all these people, basically enemies with each, living side by side, jeep by jowl with their enemies, but not only just being enemies with them, but also lovers with them, with friends with them, abusing them. You know what I mean? It's extraordinary, and imagining my family, John Stephen is my first ancestor from Robert Cooper, and imagining him on the plantation and being a son but not a son, perhaps being resented by full brothers or not, you know what I mean? The idea that, and also Robert Cooper treated all his slave children differently. So, for example, my ancestor wasn't freed, but he did free some of them, depending on his relationship to the women. You know what I mean? Can you imagine it? It was such a cauldron. And the feeling that he had to go through that back-breaking emotional process of being torn down to be made a slave was very, very upsetting for me. So I found that very difficult. I'll try and be a little bit less wordy on the second bit. And the last section was difficult, mainly because lots of it involved my living family. And as you can imagine, that was a bit of a thing. Yeah. I discovered, for example, my grandfather had neglected to mention that he also had 4 children by ladies on the land of the plantation that my mother grew up in. And if my granny had been still with us, I would have actually pulled it out of the book, because I couldn't have done that to her. Even though I knew that she kind of probably knew, kind of thing. Everybody, what Barbados is like, of course they did, but you know what I mean, the official, you know what I mean. So And also just getting it right for people who are alive. So that last section where I'm talking about my father and my mother and the people I love and my grandparents and so on was more was kind of very intensely touching for me. And you have to take a lot of care with that, especially with people doing naughty things.
I think actually you partially touched on my second question in your last response, and that was going to be the story that you told. How different do you think it would have been had you been a male writer, not a female writer? Do you think being a female writer allowed you to tell it with a certain degree of sensitivity, perhaps far more so than that we as, hear me out, that we as men may not have been able to deliver?
That's interesting because one of the reasons that my previous agent said was that I write really well about women, and that's why I should stick to writing about women. And because of the historical realities of the story of this book, the anchors are male figures because women's power, they didn't have any kind of enough social power to anchor them, you know what I mean, through the story. So it became a story about men in some ways. Obviously, it's also a story about women because, of course, that would be very interesting to me. And I don't know that maybe the thing that a woman might bring to it is trying, perhaps, and I mean, Richard's a wonderful historian, and I'm sure that, you know what I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would have thought, I was very interested in the emotional inner world as far as I could, because, the difficulty is it's not a novel, so I can't completely create inner worlds. But I became very speculative about that because that really mattered to me. I didn't want it just to be about facts and figures or anything like that. I wanted to have evidence of how, if not my own family, because I don't have records of what they felt, what other slaves felt, and what their inner lives would have been, and how that would have hurt them, what would have hurt them and disturbed them, shaped them. So I have a very intense emotional interest in how this story worked on people. So maybe that has something to do with being.
I see 2 questions here.
I think I'm holding better about a microphone actually. I kind of want to touch on a point that you made earlier. It's not directly related to the book, but kind of on a wide level. As a historian and as a writer, do you think that with all the changes to the new curriculum in history, do you think that more should be done to kind of, I think probably you implicitly agree that more should be done, but what should be done to reflect possibly in the curriculum more of a sort of hidden history of Britain? I mean, do you think that enough is being done, and what do you think should be done? Because I guess what we want for young people is more people to write these kind of stories and to research their family histories, and if you're not learning about it at school, do you think more should be done about that?
Well, it's funny you should say that. I just this week, I think it was this week, maybe the beginning of this week, I did a piece for the Guardian comment page, because what I was picking up on was, do you remember when Mr. Putin said that Britain was a small island nobody listened to?
Yeah.
And our Prime Minister, one of the things he said in our defence was that Britain helped to abolish slavery. And I kind of wanted to highlight that this indeed was true, but simultaneously we were one of the architects of slavery, particularly, certainly in the Atlantic context, and that you can't really, he really, should have not, you can't really unhinge those two things. They are irrevocably the story. So, and I was arguing that partly that Black History Month is good and wonderful, but also that the Black history is often straightforwardly British history. This story that I'm telling about Barbados is not about Barbados, but it's about England as well. And it has an impact in this country, and therefore that these histories are not Black history. They shouldn't be sidelined to a month. They shouldn't be, called Black history when in fact, Britain has been created by what happened wealth, and it's artifact, buildings, art collections, cultural, edifices, everything. These things exist because of the slaves and the sugar that the Caribbean created and used and exploited. So I was arguing that nobody in this country should ever be able to unhinge those two things. In their education, they should know both. Yes, there was a great movement for abolition, but we also made it up. We also created it in the first place, and that nobody could say that carelessly without those two notions going together. And reminding people that, that, as I said, British history, so much of what we call Black history is British history, and that these things should be part of the national curriculum across all schools, and how incredibly empowering it would be, particularly for, I think it would be useful for everybody in this country to know and understand the real story of its history, as versus the bits we want to remember, and the bits that we're constantly trying to forget. So I think it was very much for me about I very much feel that yes, it has to become more part of the wider story of Britain. I argued at the end of the piece that a mature democracy has to be able to deal with not just the stuff that makes us look good, but the stuff that that we've done wrong. And this idea, particularly taking on the idea, this rather jingoistic idea that we're going to go back to the old big history, which tends to talk a lot about Henry VIII and so on, rather than talking about the things that have shaped the community we actually have in this country.
I'm just going to make a comment and a question. I was going to make a comment about the Americans and the British, because I think if you think about it, there is no roots. We all reflect on roots and think, oh wow, that was like the first big story where you actually saw, Black history and slavery in its true form. And if you think about it, there isn't a roots equivalent to England. There's no big story that England has produced about it. So it doesn't really surprise me that the Americans would be interested in your book rather than the British. And I think a lot of Americans are more interested in their Black history than I think a lot of Black British are. But that could be because of what you said, because in the schools it's not taught. Whereas in the Caribbean, because I'm the opposite of you, I was born here and went back to Barbados. Well, I say back to Barbados, but my parents went back to Barbados in the 70s. And I'm kind of glad that happened, because I think my reflections about self is very different than a lot of Black British people who are my age. And that's kind of sad in one way. And my question to you really is, so how do you plan to promote your book? Because I think it sounds like it's a really fantastic, I'm sorry I haven't read it, but I definitely will be getting a copy. And how do you plan to take it forward so that you can expand and get the story out there? Not just to, to Black British, but to the British in general.
That's a fine question, because I'm actually just at this point trying to think that through myself, because through the my English publishers, the ones who eventually picked it up, they're for them it's a popular history guide, so they only have their very conventional channels of marketing the book. They don't really have a kind of real sense of where else it can go. So I've done lots of very literary festivals, but which very rarely reach a Black audience or even a kind of urban audience. Do you see what I mean? They're often in lovely, fragrant places. We were talking about it, the Lake District and so on and so forth. And actually we've had a very surprising. It's surprising how many people have come out and have been fascinated by the book and been interested. But these are not what really I would like is for it to go into schools and go into universities, and I don't really know how one does that. And the tragic thing is I don't think my publishers know either. So it's that thing about trying to think about how to do that. So if anybody who has suggestions, that'd be great.
TV miniseries.
Yeah.
That's what I was about to say. Probably what you should do is try to approach the BBC.
Yeah.
But we can talk after, because I do marketing, so maybe we should talk after.
Okay. I will be delighted.
This gentleman here.
Yes, I was very interested in quite a lot of what you said, but one, I haven't read the book yet, I will. But one part of an extract which comes to mind is that he spoke of leaving say a person, an immigrant, so leaving his homeland, going to a new one. He spoke of having to bury the past. Am I right in saying that you also, the other bit of it is kind of almost reinventing yourself? Now, in your own experience, did you find that difficult? Because I'm fascinated with your own background, growing up on a plantation, and perhaps the dichotomy, and the kind of enemy you must have felt, and then you kind of link then with slavery, the connotations, all that shit. Which is the question is, how easy did you find it to sort of bury the past, start all over again?
Hang on, Jerry, we need to speak to this.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. Yes, I'll start, How,
Keep it short.
yeah, all right. Yeah, how easy did you find it, to bury the past, and start all over again, when, a lot of people living here now find that very difficult?
Well, I don't think I feel, when I said, I think the metaphor I used was that migration is a kind of death, and I think that is true in that you have to lose an identity that you had from the past to some degree. I don't think that I think assimilating to Britain was extremely difficult. I found it very, very hard. I came at exactly the wrong time. If I'd been, I think if I'd been 3 or I'd been, I came in my teens. I didn't want to come. I was resistant to the whole project. My father came because he was posted in a diplomatic job here, and I also found it very difficult because my father is a doctor, and we were very socially isolated. We lived in Surrey. We were the only black family around for miles and miles, and I went to a very expensive school. I was the only black girl in my we had one black girl, me, we had one Asian girl, and we had one Japanese girl, and that was diversity at the school I went to. So it was an extremely isolated, difficult project, the whole business of becoming, able to fit in Britain. I grieved a great deal, and I think it was extremely difficult. So for me, no, I think as I say, assimilation was very hard. So when I think of it as a death, I meant it that way. And I've become, one of the ironies is that I think migration being what it is that there's an enormous element when I go back to the Caribbean. I also realize my cousins tease me about my English accent and how English I've become, and I realize that that what's that book? You Can Never Go Home Again. As much as I have a really very, what I feel about Barbados and the Caribbean is very sensually passionate. I love the Caribbean. I love going back. I love, being there. I love, my you know what I mean? There's, but I also know that I'm completely irrevocably ruined by being, living in London so long, and you know what I mean. My presumptions and the way that I live and think and so on mean that it's not an easy fit as well. That if I went back to live, I probably would find it very difficult too. So yes, I'm a miserable soul.
And there's a question at the back here.
Hello, my name is Mercedes Leal. I'm delighted to see you, Andrea. Hi, well, of course you know me as Mab. I wanted to say you've obviously blazed a brilliant and noble literary trail, and you've done very well for those of us who would like to follow you. But what advice would you give to aspiring black writers today?
Oh, that's quite general. Can you give me a little bit more specific about writing or?
About approaching agents. I mean, does one have to prove oneself more than, say, a Caucasian writer would have to? Or does it depend on the content? Obviously the content's important. What I mean is it harder for a good black writer than it is for, say, a good white writer?
Absolutely, I would say it's harder. I think you're going to be dealing with, again, this idea that inevitably a nation's literary kind of output has some connection to that nation's interests. And so I think it's quite, it would be easier if you're reflecting the story of England as England likes to remember it in your work. And almost inevitably somebody writing from a West Indian perspective has a conflicting story or a more problematic story. I also think that the publishing world goes through phases, and at the moment, there was a period in the sort of 80s and where there was a great deal more openness about looking for, there were smaller publishing houses like the Women's Press and, smaller houses that, Margaret Busby's, there were houses that were looking for black writers. I would say that market shrunk. It's a tougher market in there, and that you really have to battle. I have to say, there are some good black agents, and if I was looking for one, I would definitely hunt them out in particular. There's some black editors who you would probably want to work with, and I would also isolate those people because they are more likely to pick up your work. But I think that it is, I'm not going to lie, I think it's a difficult market. Some of my, lots of my friends are trying to be published in the US, where there is a bigger publishing world and where Caribbean studies is a huge discipline. And sometimes that can work, that could be useful to you. But it is a very difficult market, I'm not going to lie.
Thank you. That's a good challenge.
One question at the back.
Yeah. Of course, I don't think you're worried at all. You got fascinating experiences and so on, and that make you a better person, so long as you are aware, of both places and so on yourself, and you seem to be pretty aware of that. What I wanted though to ask, you spoke about life on the plantation in a fairly, I suppose, vivid way and so on. And I just want to know, how were you able to get that information? Because you were talking about your ancestors having, all these women and having the British wife and so on, and some of the interactions and so on. How you were able to get that kind of intimate knowledge about that period?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that I could recreate that period was that Robert Cooper Ashby was a very influential planter in his day. He was a colonel in the militia. He was a magistrate. He had this very large plantation. He had a very, very unbroken place in the vestry. So he's kind of, there's quite a lot of information about him still surviving in the kind of history of in Barbadian history. And one of the wonders, I would say, is that I'm sure Richard would agree, is that Barbados, we're very lucky to be from Barbados, because Barbados archives and material is fantastically well kept. So that, we have something like the Barbados Museum Journal, which, has articles on everything, which is wonderful. And we've had, our archives haven't had some of the disasters that have hit some of the other islands. Some material has been lost, of course, but there hasn't been huge floods and fires and terrible things. Grenada and various places, Dominica, I think, and lots of places had terrible problems with just the destruction of archives. So Barbados is a great place to research your family history if you happen to be from there. So that's quite helpful. So, but he's mentioned in lots of you can track him through various means. So that's how the difficulty, of course, is always, the problem is always trying to build a picture of your slave ancestors. And a lot of that had to do with doing research, which was more general and looking at, as I said, slave narratives and other people, and trying to transplant their experience and speculating about how it could have influenced him, my ancestor, or the other female ancestors, and so on. So the challenge isn't so much Robert Cooper was easy, because he is etched in history. The hard work was with the slave ancestors.
I think we have time for just one more question before we end the formal part of the evening. Of course, Andrew will be very happy to sign books for you and to speak with you individually afterwards, but we should probably, I think, just take one more question for the moment.
Thank you. Your speech was very eloquent, and I resonated with it. But and I know the emphasis is on this particular work that you've done. But have you ever given any consideration to a sequel, perhaps written from the perspective of another relative who was not as fortunate as yourself?
Sort of, actually. I've actually thought I would like to do a fiction about. There are things about my grandfather's, that whole world of the post-slave black planters. You know what I mean? Which I found it. Richard, when we were talking earlier, we were saying like, the idea that my ancestors would choose to go back into sugar production, having been slave descendants, seemed to me extraordinarily. Why? I can't. I can. We speculated, me and Richard, about. Obviously about sugar was still the biggest game in town, and it still had, this perhaps some kind of allure, but it did seem to me extraordinary. And I don't understand that my great grandfather's decision to both. And what was interesting is that both my great grandfathers on both sides, my mother and father, both my mother's great grandfathers themselves decided to buy plantations.
So the same generation as Errol Barrow's family also.
Yes.
It's the early 20th century.
Why?
Money saved up.
Brought home.
Brought in the United States, and then brought home
to buy plantations. It's time to be free, poor soul. Yeah.
Well, I wanted just to first of all to thank Tyrone and the National Council of Barbadian Associations for organising this very, very special event. But of course, I'd like to thank Andrea, for coming this evening and meeting with us. Thank you.
I would also like to thank Richard for coming all the way from Cambridge. He's incredibly busy and very, very talented man, and has lots going on. It was very kind of him to do this. I really appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. Just in my speech. We're going to have the books on sale at the back of the room at £5 each. But also I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our Deputy High Commissioner, Donald Johnson. And alongside him is, if you get my email, we talk about the Amanda Lean appeal. And next to us is Dr. Nigel Matthews Sean, who is that famous jaw surgeon, and he's here with us tonight. There's also a contemporary of Richard Drayton at Harrison College. So we break now. Make sure you buy a copy of the book.